When Rome's legions departed Britain, life continued with remarkable resilience. People built wooden homes atop crumbling Roman foundations, while villa mosaics cracked beneath practical farmhouses. Markets shifted to barter, grain for iron, wool for salt. Local warlords replaced distant emperors, providing protection for tribute. Religion blended Christian prayers with older traditions at sacred springs. Saxon arrival brought both conflict and integration, with communities mingling through marriage and trade. Through plague, climate shifts, and Viking raids, people adapted constantly. Despite hardship, they created something new: kingdoms with developing governance, stunning manuscript art, and spiritual traditions that would shape medieval Britain. For generations, we've been told a simple story about the end of Roman Britain. The legions marched away, and the island collapsed into chaos. Cities crumbled, villas burned, and 1,000 years of darkness descended until Saxon kings and Norman lords dragged the land back to order. It is a powerful tale, but it is wrong. Britain did not simply fall when Rome left. Beneath the ruins lie traces of survival, resilience, and transformation. This was not the end of civilization, but the birth of a different one. In 407, Constantine III led the last field army out of Britain. His gamble for the imperial throne carried the soldiers across the Channel, leaving their homeland behind them. The departure was quiet, no farewell carved into stone, no speeches to reassure those left behind. Only the sound of marching feet fading into silence, and ships shrinking into the grey horizon. For the people watching from the shore, 4 centuries of Roman protection had ended in a single tide. The silence after the legions must have felt louder than any battle. In towns once busy with markets, pigeons fluttered through abandoned basilicas. Coins that had carried emperors' faces ceased to matter, for no mint struck new ones. Barter replaced currency, grain for iron, wool for salt. Families scavenged fallen stone from deserted forums to build huts where shops had once stood. Yet even among the ruins, life carried on. At Wroxeter, new timber halls rose directly on the foundations of Roman baths, and in Verulamium, livestock grazed in what had been civic squares. Towns shrank, but they did not die. The countryside told a similar story. Villas that had been symbols of wealth began to decay. Mosaics cracked, roofs collapsed, weeds crawled across hypocaust floors. Some estates were abandoned, yet others remained alive in altered form. At Chedworth, repairs continued after Rome's retreat. The villa endured not as a palace of luxury, but as a farmhouse. Its stones reworked to fit a world less opulent, but still determined to survive. Where one generation had read Virgil by lamplight, the next boiled barley beer in the same courtyards. But beyond these fragile adaptations, new dangers stirred. With Hadrian's Wall unguarded, Pictish warbands swept south, raiding villas and villages, seizing cattle and captives. To the west, Irish seafarers struck deep into Cornwall and Wales, their leather boats beaching suddenly, their warriors plundering with impunity. The smoke of burning settlements must often have blackened the horizon. And still, Britain had no legions to call upon, only local strongmen who armed their neighbours and retreated to ancient hill forts. Fires once again flickered atop ramparts first raised long before Rome came. Amid fear and uncertainty, the rhythms of daily life did not vanish. Fields were still ploughed, sheep still sheared, bread still baked on clay hearths. Pottery, once shipped in from Gaul or Spain, now came from local kilns, rougher in form but made by hands that remembered old skills. Imported wine vanished, but barley beer filled mugs in its place. The world grew smaller, more local, and yet it endured. Faith, too, reflected this blending of past and present. The great basilicas, no longer maintained, crumbled into shells, but crosses were still carved into stone, even as offerings returned to rivers and groves that had been holy in older times. Burials show both traditions at once, graves aligned to Christian East and West, yet filled with jewelry or weapons that spoke of older customs. Belief had not been extinguished. It had adapted to the new world. This was Britain in the early 5th century, a land that seemed abandoned, yet still alive. Roman order had faded, but in its place, local identities emerged. In timber halls raised on ruined foundations, chiefs proclaimed themselves leaders. In villages, families leaned on barter and custom instead of imperial law. Survival was no longer guaranteed by distant emperors, but by the courage of communities bound together against hunger and raid. The story told for centuries speaks of collapse and darkness. The truth is stranger. When the legions left, Britain did not fall silent. It entered a twilight where old and new coexisted, cracked mosaics beside wooden huts, Christian prayers beside pagan rites, fear of raiders beside the stubborn labor of farmers. This twilight would soon give rise to something new, the first generation of local kings and warlords, men who claimed the mantle of Rome but forged something entirely their own. The silence Rome left behind did not remain empty for long. In the vacuum of imperial power, new voices rose, and they were not the voices of emperors or governors, but of men who could command loyalty with their swords. Britain, once governed from palaces and forums, was now held together by war bands and halls of timber. Chiefs became kings in all but name, carving out territories as fragile as they were fierce. The seeds had already been planted in the final years of Roman rule. Wealthy landowners and former officers had long held local authority, collecting taxes, commanding militias, and presiding over disputes. When the empire's authority dissolved, these figures did not vanish. Instead, they stepped into the role of protectors, claiming the right to rule by strength, by heritage, or simply by necessity. Without governors dispatched from Gaul or decrees sealed in imperial palaces, power belonged to those who could hold it. Picture a villa lord in the years after 430. His estate walls still stand, though patched and weathered. He gathers his household around him, tenants who owe him labor, freedmen who till his fields, warriors who sleep with their spears within reach. When raiders threaten, he summons them into a makeshift warband. Victories in skirmishes against Picts or Irish lend him prestige, defeats cut it away. Authority is no longer measured by imperial titles, but by the number of men willing to fight for him. Some of these men proclaimed themselves kings. The word did not yet mean what it would in centuries to come. It meant simply a ruler over a stretch of land, often no larger than a river valley or a coastal plain. Their rule was fragile, for rivals waited at every boundary, and the loyalty of followers was bound by oaths that could be broken with the promise of richer plunder. Still, these petty kings filled the void, creating a patchwork of polities where once a single province had stood. The enemies of this fractured Britain pressed harder. To the north, Pictish warbands poured through the abandoned frontier. They knew the lands they raided, farms fat with cattle, towns clinging stubbornly to life. To the west, Irish Scotti launched raids that grew bolder each year. They burned villas along the Severn, carried off slaves from coastal villages, and sometimes settled permanently in Cornwall and Wales. And then came the Saxons. At first, they arrived not as conquerors, but as mercenaries. Desperate kings turned to these sea-born warriors for aid, hiring them to fight Picts and Irish in exchange for land or plunder. It was a strategy Rome itself had once used, a solution born of pragmatism. A band of Saxons could fight as fiercely as 100 local men, and they asked no questions about politics. But their presence was dangerous. Mercenaries often became masters, and the Saxons would one day carve kingdoms of their own. The battlefield of this age was not the legion's ordered line, but the clash of war bands. Men fought shoulder to shoulder, their loyalty given to a lord rather than an emperor. Glory came not from serving a distant state, but from protecting one's kin and winning spoils to share at feasts. Timber halls echoed with the songs of bards, praising victories in skirmishes whose names are long forgotten. Around the fire, warriors drank from horns and boasted of raids, their oaths to their lord binding them more tightly than Roman law ever had. Still, life for the ordinary farmer remained much the same, and far more precarious. Fields still had to be ploughed, sheep sheared, and harvests gathered. But now, a family's safety depended on the strength of their local lord. Tribute was demanded not as tax collected for distant emperors, but as gifts owed to the man who promised protection. In return for grain or livestock, the lord sent his warriors to guard against raiders. When he failed, famine and enslavement followed. This was the age when memory and legend began to mingle. Stories of great leaders spread across valleys and coasts. One lord became known as the High King, ruling more broadly than most, though his power was fleeting. Another was remembered for victories over Saxon bands, his name later embroidered into legend as Ambrosius or Arthur. Whether or not these men existed as we imagine them, their tales reflect a truth. In the chaos after Rome, Britons longed for figures who could unite them, who could stand against the tide of invasion and uncertainty. The historical record hints at this transformation. Forts along old Roman frontiers show signs of reuse, their walls patched with timber, their granaries turned into feasting halls. Hill forts abandoned centuries before Rome's conquest blazed with new fires. In cemeteries, burials now contained weapons, spears, shields, swords, symbols of a society where warrior status meant survival. This was no longer a land of villas and mosaics. It was a land of spears and oaths, where power rested on the loyalty of armed men. To live in this age was to live in constant tension. One year, a community might enjoy peace, with fields rich and markets lively. The next, smoke might rise from the horizon, and families would flee into hills as raiders descended. Alliances shifted as quickly as the seasons. A lord might fight beside Saxon mercenaries one summer, then battle them the next when they claimed more land than promised. A king might boast of ruling 3 valleys, only to fall in battle and leave his territory divided among rivals. And yet, amid all the violence, culture endured. Songs were sung in native tongues, stories of ancestors passed down by firesides. Christianity, battered but unbroken, clung to life in remote churches and in the faith of a scattered clergy. Old pagan rites, too, survived, in offerings at springs, in rituals whispered beneath sacred groves. Belief was as fractured as the land itself, a blend of Rome's faith and Britain's oldest traditions. By 470, the island bore little resemblance to the province Rome had once governed. Gone were the legions, the governors, the steady flow of grain ships and coinage. In their place stood a patchwork of kingdoms, some lasting no longer than a man's lifetime, others enduring long enough to carve their names into history. The Britons had not surrendered. They had reshaped themselves. This transformation was both fragile and fierce. Fragile because each petty realm stood vulnerable to raids and betrayals. Fierce, because out of the ruins of Rome arose a warrior society hardened by necessity. For the men who carried spears and the lords who led them, this was an age of opportunity. For the farmers and families who lived beneath their rule, it was an age of uncertainty, where survival depended on which banner flew above the nearest hall. The empire had gone, but its shadow lingered. Britons remembered what had been lost and searched for new ways to hold their world together. From that search came the kings and warlords who would dominate the next chapter of the island's story. By the middle of the 5th century, the mercenaries Britain had welcomed were no longer temporary guests. They had come first as hired swords, their service bought with gifts of land and cattle. But what began as employment soon turned into something far more enduring. The Saxons, Angles, and Jutes who crossed the grey waters of the North Sea arrived with wives, children, and the tools of daily life. They did not intend to leave. At first, the arrangement seemed practical. Local kings desperate to defend their valleys from Picts and Irish offered land in exchange for Saxon spears. It was an old Roman tactic, barbarians fighting barbarians, with the promise of reward binding them to the soil they protected. But mercenaries quickly realized the weakness of their employers. Britain was divided, its leaders at odds, its people unprepared for relentless violence. In such a fractured land, why remain hired servants when whole fields lay waiting to be claimed? The transformation unfolded quietly at first. What had been temporary encampments near the coast became permanent halls. Timber houses appeared on riverbanks, fields cleared for crops, cattle driven into pastures. Villages with Germanic names began to dot landscapes once marked by Latin inscriptions. By the 470s, it was no longer possible to see these people as outsiders. They had become settlers, carving out a future that stretched beyond the lifespan of any warlord who had once hired them. For the Romano-Britons, who still held the richer lowlands, the Saxon presence was both threat and temptation. Some fought fiercely against encroachment, retreating into the hills of Wales or Cornwall when outnumbered. Others chose accommodation, marrying into Saxon families, trading livestock and grain, building uneasy alliances. The result was a landscape of sharp contrasts. Valleys where Germanic speech echoed in timber halls, hills where Brittonic tongues clung stubbornly to survival, and along the borders, communities where both worlds mingled uneasily. The graves of this period tell their own story, where Roman cemeteries had placed ashes in urns or laid bodies in plain stone-lined pits. The Saxons buried their dead with the symbols of life. Men were interred with spears, shields, and sometimes swords, their weapons meant to accompany them into the next world. Women lay surrounded by jewelry, brooches, and tools of household craft, their roles honored in death as in life. Children, too, were buried with small gifts, toys of bone, beads of glass, tokens of identity. Each mound or flat grave was a declaration. Here lies not a servant of Rome, but a Saxon, a member of a people who claimed this land as their own. Religion in these early communities was rooted in the old gods of the forests and skies. Woden, Lord of Wisdom, was invoked in oaths before battle. Thuna's hammer was raised to bless crops and ward off storms. Rituals tied to the cycle of the seasons guided village life: sowing, harvest, the turning of winter into spring. Sacred groves and open-air altars replaced the shrines of Roman Britain. Fires burned bright on festival nights. Songs carried across the fields, echoing traditions brought from distant homelands. And yet, traces of continuity remained. Saxons built with timber, but sometimes used stones from ruined Roman villas. A brooch might be cast in the old style, but with new patterns of spirals and beasts. Words blended too. Brittonic and Latin phrases survived in the names of rivers, hills, and scattered farmsteads, even as Germanic speech grew dominant in the east. The twilight was not only destruction, it was a mingling, uneasy and incomplete, that gave birth to something different from both Roman Britain and Saxon Germany. For ordinary villagers, life was a constant negotiation with the land and its dangers. Days began with the crow of roosters, men leading oxen to scratch furrows in heavy soil, women weaving cloth or grinding grain at querns. Children chased pigs through forest edges or gathered firewood, their laughter cutting across the harsher sounds of hammers in smithies or the clash of weapons during training. Nights were spent in smoke-filled halls, where a central hearth glowed, warriors recounting the day's labours, while elders spoke of ancestors who had crossed the sea. Survival depended on the strength of community, and community was bound together by kinship and the authority of a chieftain whose hall rose above the clustered dwellings. But for those who had once considered themselves Roman Britons, this world felt like a narrowing horizon. The villa culture had been fading since the early 5th century, and now Saxon settlement pushed its remnants westward. Farmers abandoned estates that had stood for generations, moving into hill forts that offered protection, or retreating into the mountain fastness of Wales. Monks carried fragments of literacy with them, preserving texts in tiny scriptoria, while the lowlands filled with new settlers who had little use for books. A sense of twilight hung over the old ways, not sudden collapse, but a fading, as if the light of Rome was dimming even as new fires took hold in Saxon halls. This is the paradox of the age. Later chroniclers would remember it as a time of invasion, of Britons driven like cattle before an unstoppable tide. Archaeology, however, reveals both continuity and displacement. Some Britons fought and died resisting, their remains scattered in violent burials. Others lived side by side with Saxons, their crafts and customs blending. Still others fled to Armorica, across the Channel, where their descendants would give the land the name of Brittany. The story was not one of simple conquest, but of mingled destinies, woven together by chance, necessity, and survival. By the end of the 5th century, the eastern half of Britain bore little resemblance to the province that had once stood under Rome. Instead of stone towns and tiled villas, timber villages marked the land. Instead of Roman law, kinship and oath governed disputes. Instead of Latin, the guttural sounds of Old English began to dominate. Along the frontier, where Saxon settlement ended and Brittonic power endured, tensions simmered. This borderland would become the crucible of legend, the place where stories of great leaders, Arthur among them, were born. And so, as one people were pushed west and another rooted themselves in the fertile lowlands, Britain entered a new stage of its long transformation. It was not yet the land of united kingdoms or Christian cathedrals. It was a patchwork of villages, war bands, and fragile alliances, a place where the memory of Rome lingered faintly in stone ruins, while a new culture grew strong in timber halls. Out of that tension, myth and history became inseparable, and the Britain we think we know was only beginning to take shape. At the century's end, Britain found itself poised on the edge of a blade. Power rested with local lords, each ruling a valley or stretch of coast, their people bound by sworn loyalty and the promise of bread and meat at the hall table. Beyond their boundaries, Saxon settlements spread across fertile plains, and every spring, new ships appeared on eastern shores. Life was a cycle of raids, skirmishes, and uneasy truces. And yet, Out of this turmoil, whispers grew of a leader who could turn scattered warriors into an army. Later generations gave him a name that would echo through legend: Arthur. The archaeology of the time does not spell out his story, but it hints at the kind of figure people remembered. At South Cadbury in Somerset, ancient ramparts were reforged, crowned by stout defences and a great hall that looked down over the countryside. At Dinas Powys in Wales, craftsmen hammered fine ornaments for a lord who ruled by both wealth and steel. Along the Cornish coast at Tintagel, imported jars from the Mediterranean prove that trade still reached Britain, even as invaders pressed in. These sites show not a land abandoned, but one where strong rulers rose to defend what remained. Men capable of feeding warriors, arming them, and holding the line for a generation. The battles of these years were fought without legions. There were no long lines of disciplined soldiers, only household war bands, companions who knew each other's voices in the dark, who stood shoulder to shoulder to shoulder around a lord they trusted. Loyalty was sealed with meat and mead, with gifts of silver rings or finely worked spearheads. A leader who could keep his followers fed and victorious gained renown. One who failed was abandoned for another haul. In this world, a man's reputation could stretch further than his territory, carried in the songs of bards who praised him at feasts across the island. Memory clung most tightly to a single clash, the battle near a place later called Baden. The earliest writer to mention it does not name a commander, only that the Britons won a great victory there. Later tradition placed Arthur at its heart, riding in the thick of the fight where the line bent. Whoever led that stand, the effect was real. For a generation afterward, Saxon advance faltered. Farmers in the west sowed their fields without fear. Shepherds grazed flocks in valleys once abandoned, and children grew up without constant flight. It was not peace everywhere, but it was breathing space, and people remembered the man they believed had given it to them. Picture such a leader at dawn before battle. The frost clings to grass, breath clouds the air. He walks the line, touching shoulders, speaking quietly to men who have shared his hearth. On one flank, javelin throwers from the hills shift restlessly. On the other, veterans from a frontier fort hold shields scarred by earlier fights. In the center stand his sworn companions, bound to him not by empire, but by loyalty stronger than blood. When the enemy presses the ford, there are no trumpets, only the crash of water and a shout that carries his voice. This is the world in which an Arthur could exist, not the crowned king of romance, but a commander of war bands, decisive in the moment when survival hung by a thread. Life in the settlements reflected the same tension. In timber halls, smoke curled through the rafters as warriors feasted, bards recited, and gifts were shared. Women rationed grain through lean winters, spun wool, and kept families alive when raiding pulled men away. Children carried water, drove pigs, and learned to listen for changes in the night air that warned of danger. Priests traveled between villages with books wrapped in leather, reading aloud to those who could not decipher letters but felt the weight of the words. At springs and crossroads, offerings still appeared, grain, coins long out of use, gifts to both Christ and older spirits, for no one wished to risk silence in an age of uncertainty. The faith that clung to life in these decades was a patchwork, much like the politics around it. Churches in ruins gave way to small chapels. Hermits built cells near holy wells, their prayers mingling with rituals remembered from the deep past. A carved cross on a standing stone could guard a path, but so might a charm whispered in the old tongue. Saints' lives began to circulate, stories of miracles that reassured listeners that heaven still cared for Britain's fate. Even in warrior halls, a guest with a tonsure could claim protection, though whether that mercy sprang from piety or fear of divine punishment, no one could say. Not all the fighting was in open fields. Siege warfare returned to the island in crude form. A warband might encircle a hill fort, lighting watchfires and waiting until hunger forced surrender. At other times, a gate was battered down, houses fired, smoke choking the lungs of those trapped within. Leaders who survived long enough to win renown learned to adapt Roman tactics to their reduced resources. Night sorties to burn ladders, ambushes at fords, sudden sallies that broke the rhythm of a siege. The ruins of old empire taught new lessons to men who had never seen a legion. In borderlands, coexistence was often as common as battle. Families with Saxon fathers and Brittonic mothers appeared, bound together not by ideology, but by the need to survive. Markets encouraged pragmatism. Salt, wool, and grain moved between camps even when spears were raised elsewhere. A reputation for fairness could hold a valley together more securely than fear, and leaders who understood this left longer marks than those who ruled by terror alone. From these fragments grew the legend. Later poets embroidered the tale until it gleamed with gold, swords with names, tables of justice, queens whose beauty altered history. Yet beneath the finery lay the outline of something real, a leader whose victories gave his people time, whose reputation stretched across valleys, whose memory became a vessel for hope. Strip away the embellishments, and what remains is the idea of a champion who turned back the tide long enough for a generation to breathe. For ordinary Britons, that breathing space was everything. It meant fields ploughed 2 seasons in a row, oxen kept alive instead of slaughtered for winter meat, and children growing to adulthood without seeing their homes in flames. It meant monks copying a psalm not once, but twice, one for use, one for beauty. It meant shepherds singing again in valleys thought lost. Stability, even brief, left traces deeper than a single raid or victory. But no pause lasts forever. Pressure rebuilt in the east, and ambitious newcomers raised champions of their own. Within the west, rival chiefs who had bent to a strong hand grew restless as soon as that grip weakened. Legends could not hold shield walls together once the man at their heart was gone. When he fell, whether in battle or in bed, the question that filled the halls was always the same. Who now? Arthur, or whoever wore his name, stands at the hinge of Britain's memory. Behind him lay the last echoes of Rome, still alive in a bishop's blessing or a veteran's discipline. Ahead stretched the harder age of timber kingdoms, where rule rested on feasts, oaths, and quick blades. He is remembered because people needed him to be remembered, not for the glittering myths that later ages wove, but for the breathing space his victories seemed to grant. His story is a reminder that even in the darkest years, one figure, real or imagined, could carry the hope of a people who refused to vanish. When Rome's power dissolved, the church it had planted in Britain withered alongside it. Once there had been bishops attending councils on the continent, basilicas rising in provincial towns, priests supported by imperial stipends. By the early 6th century, those structures had crumbled. Councils no longer met. Bishops were scarce, and great churches stood roofless, their altars cracked and their mosaics fading under ivy. Christianity had not vanished, but it was no longer the steady, organized faith that Rome had imposed. It survived in scattered pockets, fragile, uncertain, carried by wandering clerics, by families who remembered prayers, and by monks who began to carve out new sanctuaries on the margins of the world. In the West, where Britons had retreated before Saxon settlement, faith clung most stubbornly. In the valleys of Wales and Cornwall, in the rugged coasts of Devon, in the highlands of Cumbria, priests and monks found shelter among local rulers who still claimed the Roman inheritance. There, timber churches stood beside old wells, and crosses were carved into stones that had once been pagan markers. Worship was improvised, intimate, and fiercely local. Instead of basilicas, there were chapels of rough masonry. Instead of vast congregations, there were clusters of families gathering in the open air, led by a single tonsured figure who might also serve as healer, teacher, and judge. Ireland, beyond the empire's reach, was now sending its own missionaries across the sea. From Iona, from Bangor, from Clonmacnoise, bands of monks set out in leather coracles, their oars pulling them toward Britain's western shores. They carried no imperial mandate, only the conviction that their way of life, a life of prayer, fasting, and study, could bring renewal to lands where Christianity seemed to be fading. These were men of austere discipline, shaped by the windswept monasteries of their homeland, where stone cells clung to cliffs, and prayer was as constant as the surf below. In Britain, their presence brought a different flavor of faith, one less tied to Rome's hierarchy and more to a personal, almost heroic pursuit of holiness. The monasteries they founded became islands of light in a dim age. At first, they were little more than clusters of huts around a chapel, ringed by a ditch or low wall. Inside, life was harsh, but purposeful. Monks rose before dawn, chanted psalms in Latin, worked the fields, copied what manuscripts they could find, and offered hospitality to travelers. In a time when violence could come without warning, these places stood as both refuge and beacon. To peasants weary of war, the sight of a monastery's cross on a hilltop meant safety, or at least the hope of it. To lords who gave them land, monasteries offered prestige, prayers for the dead, and a link to the wider Christian world. But faith in these centuries was not cleanly divided between Christian and pagan. Old rites persisted everywhere. Farmers still left offerings in streams for a good harvest. Women whispered charms over infants to guard them from illness. Warriors carried talismans of bone or antler, along with the sign of the cross. In cemeteries, burials blended customs. Graves aligned east to west, as Christians preferred, yet filled with weapons or jewelry, echoes of older belief. It was not hypocrisy, but necessity. In an uncertain world, people turned to every source of strength they could find. The result was a faith that was neither wholly pagan nor fully Roman, but a hybrid, uniquely British, forged in hardship. Stories of saints capture the strange mix of this era. Iltud, said to have been a soldier before turning to monastic life, founded a school in Wales that drew students from across Britain. Samson, one of his pupils, journeyed through Cornwall and across the Channel, his reputation for miracles spreading wherever he preached. David, remembered as Dewi Sant, became the most revered of Welsh saints, known for his ascetic life, his preaching, and the monasteries he established. In legend, he stood on a hill while preaching, and the ground itself rose beneath his feet so the crowd could hear him, a story that symbolized the rising authority of monastic leaders in a world where secular kings often fell short. For ordinary people, Christianity in this period was less about grand theology and more about daily survival. A priest blessed the fields before planting. A monk wrote charms that mingled scripture with older incantations to ward off plague. Pilgrims carried water from holy wells, believing it could heal the sick. The line between miracle and medicine blurred. Faith was practical, immediate, bound to the rhythms of weather and war. In this way, it took root more deeply than the distant imperial Christianity of earlier centuries had ever managed. Still, the Church of Britain stood apart from Rome. Its practices diverged, the way monks cut their hair, the calendar they used to reckon Easter, even the forms of their liturgy. Cut off from the continent, they developed their own traditions, carried by memory rather than decree. When later missionaries arrived from Rome to bring the island back into line, these differences would spark fierce debates. But for now, what mattered was endurance. In the midst of famine, plague, and raids, faith endured. And from that endurance grew a culture of learning, prayer, and resilience that would outlast kingdoms. The monasteries became more than religious centers. They became Britain's libraries, treasuries, and schools. In their scriptoria, monks bent over wooden desks, scratching ink onto vellum. Each word copied was an act of defiance against forgetting. They preserved psalms and gospels, but also fragments of Roman learning, histories, poems, medical treatises. When later centuries looked back, it was these communities that had carried memory across the dark waters of time. Without them, much of the island's past would have been erased. Christianity's survival was fragile, but it was also tenacious. Raiders burned churches, but faith rebuilt them. Leaders fell, but monks continued their prayers. Families lost to famine left behind children raised by monasteries, who carried songs and scriptures into the next generation. In the wreckage of empire, the church provided a thread of continuity, even if its weave was patchy and frayed. For many, that thread was enough to keep despair at bay. By the middle of the 6th century, Britain's faith had settled into this strange pattern: scattered strongholds of Christianity, surrounded by lands where old gods and new saints shared the same soil. The church was no longer imperial. It was local, personal, often improvised. And yet, in its weakness, it found a kind of strength. It adapted, blended, endured. The faith that survived in Britain's hills and valleys was not the faith Rome had left, but it was one that would prove resilient enough to shape the centuries ahead. Smoke still rose from monastery hearths, and the sound of hammers echoed in village smithies when a new terror crept into Britain, one that no spear could turn aside. It came not in war bands or fleets, but in unseen breath, carried on trade winds and the sails of ships. People called it pestilence, a punishment from heaven, a shadow that swallowed whole households in a matter of days. Later ages would know it as the Justinian plague, the sickness that rolled across Europe and reached even these distant shores. Imagine a hamlet in the Severn Valley at the height of summer. Barley stands tall, sheep graze in the hills, and life seems steady after years of war. Then, in the space of a week, neighbors fall with fevers that burn hot and fast. Swellings rise under their arms, dark blotches spread across their skin, and by nightfall, some are already gone. Whole families vanish, leaving huts empty, tools scattered, meals half prepared on tables. Graves multiply, dug in haste, sometimes unmarked because there are too few left alive to tend them. The plague tore through villages and halls alike, and for those who survived, the memory of its suddenness lingered like a scar. As if disease were not enough, the skies themselves turned hostile. Around the same decade, strange weather spread across the world. Chroniclers in far-off lands wrote of dimmed sunlight, of summers that never warmed, of harvests that failed. In Britain, shorter growing seasons brought famine to a people already weakened by plague. Frost lingered in valleys where crops should have ripened. Rain flooded fields, rotting grain in the ear. When stores ran low, Families slaughtered livestock they had hoped to keep for breeding. Hunger gnawed alongside sickness, and despair hung over villages like a permanent winter. For communities already living on the edge, these disasters shifted the balance of life. Fields were abandoned when too few hands remained to plough them. Settlements shrank, some vanishing altogether, their outlines later traced only by archaeologists finding post holes and potsherds beneath the soil. The labour shortage forced survivors to regroup. Villages combined, families banded together, and authority fell to whichever leader could provide food and protection. Lords who had once measured wealth by warriors now found themselves counting bushels of grain and the cattle still standing in their pastures. In famine years, power belonged not only to the man with the sharpest sword, but to the one with stores of barley in his granaries. Religion offered explanations when reason could not. Priests warned that plague was punishment for sin, urging fasting and repentance. Monks wrote prayers of deliverance and carried relics in solemn processions, hoping to chase sickness from their valleys. At holy wells, people drew water by torchlight, whispering ancient charms alongside Christian blessings. Across the island, old and new faiths mingled in ritual responses to terror. Some sacrificed animals at boundary stones. Others lit candles before crude wooden crosses. Fear made people reach for any comfort. And in this fusion of practices, British Christianity absorbed yet more of the island's older traditions. Yet even in disaster, life did not vanish. Survivors adapted to the new climate with resilience. Fields shifted from grain to hardier crops. Sheep and cattle herding grew in importance when cereal harvests failed. Woodland, once cleared for farming, crept back over abandoned estates, but the timber it provided became a vital resource for rebuilding halls and chapels. Communities that endured found strength in their adaptability, crafting a culture hardened by loss but skilled in survival. Archaeological traces confirm this resilience. In Cornwall and Western Wales, imported pottery from the Mediterranean still appears in layers dating to these troubled decades. Trade had not ended. Ships still crossed seas, carrying amphorae of oil and wine, even while plague travelled with them. At Tintagel, shards of Byzantine glass sparkle in the soil, evidence that despite famine, some lords maintained connections that stretched beyond the horizon. These finds tell us that catastrophe did not seal Britain off from the wider world. Instead, it forced a narrowing for most, but for a few, opportunity still flickered. Stories of saints from this era also reflect the dual shadow of disease and renewal. Gildas, writing in the mid-6th century, railed against moral decay, insisting that God had sent disaster as chastisement. His words, bitter and relentless, paint a picture of a society on the brink, corrupted by sin and punished by plague. Yet in the same decades, tales of holy men healing the sick spread across Britain. St. Columba in the north, David in Wales, and countless unnamed clerics became beacons of hope. To common folk, the power of a saint to drive away illness or bring rain meant more than the failures of kings. Monastic centres grew not only as places of prayer, but as refuges where the sick might find comfort and the hungry might beg bread. For those who survived, the plague and the harsh years that followed redrew the map of Britain's society. Populations thinned, but the bonds within surviving communities tightened. Authority shifted toward those who could provide continuity in chaos. Chiefs who fed their followers gained loyalty deeper than any oath of war, and monasteries that distributed food found themselves at the center of local power. This was a Britain where famine and faith walked hand in hand, reshaping the landscape as surely as any invasion. The memory of these years haunted the generations that followed. Families told stories of nights when no fires burned, because all had died inside a settlement. Survivors carried tales of kin, lost within hours, of cattle wandering masterless in empty fields. Yet from these same decades came the endurance that allowed later kingdoms to rise. Hardship taught adaptability. Communities that could weather plague and climate upheaval could face enemies with a hardened spirit. Out of loss grew resilience, and out of resilience grew the foundations of Britain's next age. When the skies finally cleared and the seasons steadied, the survivors looked out on a changed land. Fields lay fallow, where villages had once thrived. But in other places, new halls rose, and fresh boundaries were marked. Christianity emerged stronger, reshaped by the blending of old rites with new devotion. Lords rebuilt their authority, now grounded as much in their ability to sustain life as in their skill at leading warriors. The island had suffered, but it had not broken. Instead, it had been tempered, like iron thrust into fire and then cooled, harder than before. The plague had shown how fragile human life could be. The climate's cruelty had proved how quickly fortune could turn. But those who endured carried forward not only grief, but lessons. In the silence after disaster, new voices of leadership emerged. They would guide Britain into its next chapter. The rise of kingdoms more stable, more enduring, built on the resilience born from plague and famine. The storms of plague and famine slowly passed, and in their wake the island stirred with new ambition. Where scattered warlords had once ruled from timber halls, stronger chieftains now gathered power, binding larger territories beneath their banners. On the eastern plains, where Saxon and Angle settlers had rooted themselves a century earlier, these leaders rose from tribal heads into kings. Their halls grew grander, their commands stretched further, and their names began to echo across Britain. This was the dawn of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Kent was among the first to emerge as a true realm. Its position by the straits gave it wealth from trade, and its rulers knew how to wield it. Ships from the continent touched its shores, carrying glass, wine, and fine weapons. Frankish gold coins found their way into Kentish burials, proof that this new kingdom was already tied into networks stretching beyond the Channel. Its kings did not merely fight, they negotiated, married into foreign dynasties, and displayed the trappings of power with a confidence no single warlord had matched before. Further along the southern coast, Sussex and Wessex took shape. Sussex grew in the shadow of older tribal territories, while Wessex, born of migrants who had pressed inland from the southern shore, spread along the fertile valleys of the Thames and Avon. Here, warriors raised halls on chalk ridges, their roofs thatched with reeds, their walls daubed with lime, their hearths blazing at the heart of each community. Around these halls clustered farms where peasants bent to the plough, driving oxen through heavy soil, their sweat and toil feeding the ambitions of their lords. In the east, Essex and East Anglia came into being, their names preserving the memory of the tribes that founded them. Essex, land of the East Saxons, looked toward London, whose Roman ruins still loomed over the Thames, even as Saxon villages grew nearby. East Anglia, flat and open, became a realm of broad fields and estuaries, where Angle chieftains ruled from timber complexes surrounded by marshes. Here, burial mounds began to rise, signaling the power of leaders who wanted their memory sealed in earth and song. These were not the short-lived dominions of an earlier age. They were kingdoms, claiming permanence through ritual, law, and bloodline. Yet kingdoms were more than their rulers. Beneath the high seats of kings sat the warrior aristocracy, men bound by oaths who fought for land, loot, and honor. These nobles, or thegns, measured wealth in cattle and treasure, but also in the followers they could summon. A lord who feasted his men, rewarded them with weapons, and upheld their dignity, commanded loyalty. One who failed saw his retinue drift away to more generous halls. Power flowed from these bonds, and kings who neglected them did not last. In a world without standing armies, every battle was decided by the strength of a ruler's gift-giving hand. The lives of common folk, though less celebrated, were the foundation of these kingdoms. Farmers rose at dawn, yoked oxen to ploughs, and sowed seed in narrow strips of field. Their houses were sunken, floored huts, warm with smoke, where weaving looms clacked and families gathered around modest hearths. Seasons ruled their world, planting in spring, reaping in summer, storing for winter. Tribute demanded by lords took a portion of every harvest, but without it, protection would falter. When raiders threatened, villagers gathered in halls or fled to woods, praying their lord's warriors would drive the danger off. Their survival fed the glory of kings, even if their names went unrecorded. Religion in these rising realms followed the gods of the north. Woden's ravens were invoked before battle. Thuna's hammer blessed fields and marriages, and Tu, god of the spear, was honored by warriors who sought victory. Sacred groves and wooden temples stood at the heart of communities, places where sacrifices were offered to ensure fertility and fortune. Seasonal festivals marked the turning of the year, binding people together in shared ritual. Yet even here, Christianity lingered in pockets of the West, carried by monks and priests who clung to their faith among Brittonic communities. The land was divided not only by language and law, but by belief. The difference between Briton and Saxon grew sharper as these kingdoms solidified. To the east and south, Germanic tongues dominated, carried in the speech of courts and common folk alike. Place names shifted, with villages taking on endings like ham, tun, and berry, supplanting the Latin and Brittonic titles of earlier centuries. To the west, Britons held their ground in Wales and Cornwall, their leaders looking back to a Roman past, even as they forged their own identities. Between them stretched borderlands where the two peoples clashed, mingled, and sometimes intermarried. But the cultural divide deepened with every passing decade. The material world of the Saxon kingdoms reflected both hardship and aspiration. Graves from this era are filled with objects that speak to status: ornate brooches, glass beads, iron swords, and shields painted with bright patterns. In some cemeteries, warriors were laid to rest with their weapons beside them, a testimony to the value placed on martial identity. Women's burials often contained jewelry, weaving tools, and household items, symbols of their roles in maintaining community life. Even in death, these goods told a story of hierarchy, wealth, and the pride of belonging to a people who saw themselves not as outsiders, but as rightful heirs to the land they had taken. Kings sought to cement their authority through ritual as much as through arms. Assemblies of freemen met at sacred sites to swear loyalty, settle disputes, and confirm laws spoken aloud. Oaths were binding, sealed before gods, and breaking them brought ruin. The authority of a ruler was measured not only in victories, but in his ability to keep peace among rivals, to adjudicate fairly, and to maintain the fragile balance between generosity and discipline. In these gatherings, the seeds of future law codes were sown, though at the time they were carried only in memory and voice. Across the Channel, observers began to take notice. Frankish writers mention rulers of Kent and other regions, proof that these new kingdoms had entered the awareness of Europe. Diplomatic ties, fostered through marriage and trade, gave the Saxon elites prestige beyond their shores. Exotic goods, garnets, silver, glass found their way into Britain, and with them came ideas of kingship that blended native custom with continental models. These connections strengthened the identity of the Anglo-Saxon realms, making them part of the wider tapestry of post-Roman Europe. For the Britons watching from the west, the rise of these kingdoms was a grave threat. Each passing year saw Saxon dominion expand, and each new king meant another centre of power to resist. Yet their persistence in Wales, Cornwall, and the north shows that the struggle was not one-sided. Fortresses were rebuilt, alliances forged, and raids launched in return. The island remained contested ground, its peoples divided but unbroken, each side convinced of its right to the land. By the close of the 6th century, Britain had transformed. The chaos of warlords had given way to structured kingdoms. Kent, Sussex, Wessex, Essex, and East Anglia stood as established realms, while in the north, the foundations of Bernicia and Deira, future Northumbria, were being laid. These polities were not yet the great powers they would one day become, but their roots had sunk deep. With their gods, their halls, and their laws, they claimed permanence in a land still scarred by memory of plague and war. The ascendancy of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was not the end of Britain's story, but the beginning of a new one. Their rise brought both order and division, stability for those within their bounds, and despair for those pushed aside. They had survived plague and famine, seized opportunity from chaos, and now stood poised to shape the island's destiny. Yet even as their power grew, another tide was stirring beyond the horizon, a tide that would come not with warbands, but with missionaries, carrying a faith that promised to remake these kingdoms from within. Along the shores of Kent, ships once more appeared, but these were not the long vessels of raiders with dragon heads on their prows. Their sails carried no warriors seeking plunder, but men dressed in black robes, their mission not conquest, but conversion. In the spring of 597, Augustine and his companions landed on the Isle of Thanet, sent by Pope Gregory the Great with a bold command: to bring the light of Roman Christianity back to the island that had drifted from the empire's faith. For the Saxon kingdoms that had risen out of war and famine, this arrival marked the beginning of a new transformation, one that would pierce even the halls of kings. The story of Augustine's mission began far from Britain. Gregory, Bishop of Rome, is said to have once walked through a Roman market and seen fair-haired boys for sale as slaves. When told they were Angles, he answered that they were fit to be angels. The tale may be embellished, but the sentiment was genuine. To him, Britain was not merely another mission field. It was a former province of Rome, once Christian, now fallen away. Sending a mission, there was as much about reclaiming lost ground as saving new souls. Augustine and his party crossed Gaul with trepidation, hesitant about the journey to what they imagined as a savage and pagan land. Some nearly turned back. Gregory's stern letters reminded them of their purpose and pressed them onward. When they finally landed on Kent's coast, they were received not with spears, but with curiosity. Ethelbert, King of Kent, agreed to meet them, though he insisted the first encounter take place in the open air, lest the strangers use sorcery within closed walls. On Thanet's fields, he listened while Augustine preached of salvation and eternal life. The king was not yet persuaded, but he allowed the strangers to remain and speak freely. Ethelbert was no ordinary chieftain. His marriage to Bertha, a Frankish princess and a Christian, had already given him familiarity with the new faith. In Canterbury, Bertha maintained a small chapel where she worshipped, tended by her own priest. Through her influence, the ground was prepared for Augustine's message. The king understood, as well, that aligning with Rome brought more than religion. It offered prestige, alliances, and a connection to the wider Christian world. In an age when continental ties meant wealth and power, conversion carried political weight. Augustine and his companions set about their mission with humility but also determination. They established themselves in Canterbury, making the city their base. There they rebuilt old Roman structures for worship, sang their offices in Latin, and tended to the poor, actions that impressed those who watched. Miracles were attributed to them, whether healings or protections from plague, and word of their deeds spread quickly. What persuaded more than anything was their discipline, the sight of men living simply, praying constantly, and serving without demand for wealth. In a land accustomed to chiefs who ruled by display and power, such steadiness was striking. When Ethelbert himself accepted baptism, it marked a turning point. His choice was not forced upon his people, but many followed. On feast days, rivers around Canterbury filled with men and women wading into the waters, emerging with the sign of the cross traced on their foreheads. Timber churches rose, simple at first, but visible markers that a new faith was rooting itself in Saxon soil. Augustine was consecrated bishop, and Canterbury became the seat of a new archbishopric, destined to remain the heart of English Christianity for centuries. But the arrival of Augustine's mission did not mean instant victory for Rome's faith. Across the island, Celtic Christianity already flourished in Wales, Cornwall, Ireland, and the north. These communities traced their lineage not to Rome, but to saints who had preached in exile, lived as hermits, and founded austere monasteries in rugged landscapes. Their monks wore different tonsures, followed different calendars, and placed their authority in abbots rather than bishops. Where Augustine's mission represented order, hierarchy, and papal command, the Celtic Church embodied independence, asceticism, and local tradition. For villagers and lords alike, this meant the landscape of belief grew more complex. A Saxon farmer might attend sacrifices at a pagan shrine during harvest, hear a monk's sermon when travelling, and later witness a royal baptism at court. Religion was no longer singular but contested, a field where different voices claimed the right to guide souls. At times, the tension brought conflict, but more often it created a mingling. Pagan charms whispered beside Christian prayers, old wells rededicated to saints, festivals that blended both fire rituals and church feasts. The daily presence of Christianity changed village life in subtle ways. A priest might bless seeds before planting or write charms against sickness. Monks built schools for noble children, teaching them Latin letters so they might serve in administration. Songs of pagan gods gave way, slowly, to hymns of Christ and the saints, though both might still be sung by the same lips. With the church came literacy, law, and new forms of memory. Records began to be kept again, charters written, chronicles composed. Where words had once been preserved only in oral song, ink once more fixed them on parchment. The mission's success in Kent did not immediately extend beyond its borders. Other kingdoms watched carefully, weighing the benefits of Roman alliance against the risk of abandoning old gods. Sussex, Essex, and East Anglia hesitated, still clinging to their pagan rites. In the north, new powers like Northumbria grew stronger, their rulers cautious of foreign priests. Yet the example of Kent planted a seed. Conversion was no longer unthinkable. It had become an option rulers might one day choose. For the common people, what mattered most was survival, not doctrine. If a Christian priest could heal a child, he was respected. If a pagan rite brought rain, it was performed. If a saint's relic was said to guard against plague, villagers flocked to see it. The blending of belief was messy, imperfect, and deeply human. The old gods did not vanish overnight, nor did Christianity triumph in a single generation. Instead, the two lived side by side, shaping a society that walked with one foot in the past and one in the future. Augustine himself did not live to see the whole island turn. His mission laid foundations, but left many challenges unresolved. He struggled with Celtic monks who refused to acknowledge Rome's authority. He faced the limits of royal power, realizing that not all subjects followed their king's faith. Yet his work marked a beginning. From the wooden churches of Kent would grow cathedrals. From the first river, baptisms would come a nationwide church. The landing at Thanet was a hinge in history, a moment when Britain opened its door to a faith that would eventually weave itself into every part of its identity. When those black-robed strangers first stepped onto Kentish soil, no one could have guessed how deeply their presence would shape the centuries to come. They brought no armies, built no fortresses, yet the transformation they began was as profound as any conquest. Through patience, persuasion, and the quiet persistence of prayer, Augustine's mission planted a seed of renewal. In the shadow of war and the memory of famine, it promised a different kind of strength. Not the might of swords, but the endurance of faith. The black-robed strangers who had stepped onto the shores of Kent had brought new prayers. But in the decades that followed, the island was still shaped most of all by the clash of swords. Kingdoms were rising everywhere, their borders uncertain, their ambitions unchecked. In this age, rulers secured their authority not through parchment or decree, but by raiding neighbors, defending their halls, and gathering warriors around them in a rhythm of battle and feast. War was the forge, and from it the strongest realms began to take lasting form. Across the south, Kent basked in its prestige from conversion, but its kings soon faced rivals who were less interested in baptism than in territory. Sussex and Essex jostled for land and influence, their warriors clashing in valleys where crops were trampled beneath hoofbeats. In East Anglia, warlords built burial mounds for fallen leaders, their treasures interred as signs of both grief and status. To the west, Wessex expanded along the river valleys, its kings demanding tribute from villages once beyond their reach. The island was no longer a patchwork of petty chiefs. It was becoming a theatre of competing kingdoms, each determined to carve a name that would outlive the man who wore the crown. Nowhere was this ambition fiercer than in the north. Bernicia, centered on the fortress of Bamberg, thrust outward from the coast, its kings looking south toward fertile lands. Dara, based further inland, grew powerful in turn, and the two realms collided in repeated struggles. Sometimes they fought as rivals. Sometimes they joined forces under a single banner, creating the larger power that later generations would call Northumbria. In these battles, the destiny of northern Britain was being shaped, one campaign at a time. Life in the halls of these warlike kings revolved around the warrior retinue, the comitatus. A lord's household was filled with men who pledged loyalty in exchange for protection, plunder, and honor. They ate at his table, slept by his hearth, and followed him into battle with the certainty that their fortunes were bound together. In return, the king was expected to be generous. He gave gifts of rings, brooches, and finely crafted weapons. He poured mead at feasts with his own hand. He ensured that no warrior felt forgotten. This bond of reciprocity was stronger than law, and betrayal was despised above all else. The rhythms of war touched everyone, not just the men who carried spears. Farmers planted and harvested knowing that at any moment their work might be destroyed by raiding parties. Women managed households alone when husbands were called to campaigns. Children grew up listening to stories of heroes who died with honor, their deaths recited in verse by bards who made the hall resound with memory. Victory brought celebration and treasure. Defeat meant famine, slavery, and grief. Every family lived in the shadow of the warband, whether as part of it or as those who paid its price. Raiding was not always about conquest. Sometimes it was about wealth, sometimes about proving strength. A sudden strike into enemy territory might seize cattle or captives, burn storehouses, and withdraw before the foe could gather. Such raids weakened rivals, enriched the attackers, and reminded everyone of a king's reach. Captives became slaves, traded or absorbed into households. The slave markets of the age were quiet but constant, supplying labor for farms and prestige for those who commanded many dependents. In this way, warfare sustained both economy and hierarchy. Religion also played its part in war. Pagan rites accompanied campaigns. Omens were read in the flight of birds, sacrifices made before the gods of battle. Warriors believed their fate was woven long before they fought, but courage could win them a name sung after death. Yet Christian priests, now gaining ground in Kent and beyond, spoke of a different reward, eternal life for the baptized. Some kings began to weigh which faith gave greater power, the gods of their fathers or the new god of Rome, whose priests offered not only salvation, but also alliances across the sea. The mingling of belief was visible in burial grounds. At Sutton Hoo, a ship was laid in the earth, its hull filled with treasure. A great helmet, gold buckles, silver bowls, and a sword fit for a lord. Though pagan in ritual, the objects within carried designs influenced by Christian art from the continent. The burial spoke of a world in transition, where old customs met new symbols, and rulers sought to display authority in every form they could claim. Such splendor was rare, but it revealed the ambitions of kings who wanted their names remembered as more than raiders. They sought to be builders of realms. Everyday life went on amid this turbulence. Fields were ploughed in narrow strips, huts repaired with timber and thatch, and livestock tended with care. Markets still convened, though often under the watchful eyes of armed men. Villagers bartered for salt, grain, and tools, their exchanges carried out in the shadow of looming fortresses. Peace was never guaranteed, but people adapted. They learned to rebuild quickly after raids, to hide stores in pits, to shift flocks to safer pastures. Survival became its own kind of resilience, a stubborn refusal to vanish even when war seemed endless. As kingdoms grew stronger, alliances became as vital as raids. Marriages were arranged to seal truces, daughters given as queens to foreign rulers, sons fostered in rival courts to ensure loyalty. These ties created a web of obligation that stretched across Britain and into Gaul. A king who could not manage them risked isolation and defeat. One who mastered them might see his lineage endure beyond his own lifetime, his children inheriting both crown and song. The decades around 600 to 630 were not only about destruction, they were about the shaping of Britain's political map. In the north, Northumbria's rise signalled the emergence of a power that could dominate its neighbours. In the south, Kent's prestige from Augustine's mission gave it a voice in European affairs. Across the Midlands, Mercia began to stir, its lords forging a kingdom that would one day rival all others. These were still fragile states, vulnerable to betrayal and sudden death in battle. But compared to the chaos of earlier generations, they carried the beginnings of continuity. For the Britons, who still held the West, these changes were both threat and warning. Kingdoms now stood on their borders, with more organization, more ambition, and more resources than ever before. The dream of a united defense under legendary figures like Arthur was long gone. Now, survival required new strategies, alliances with monasteries, fortifications of stone, or appeals to faith that promised divine aid. The struggle between Saxon and Britain was no longer a contest of raids alone. It was a clash of kingdoms, each seeking permanence in a land where permanence had always been fragile. War, raid, and kingdom building defined this age. It was brutal, yes, but it was also creative, giving shape to structures that would outlast the men who raised them. The songs sung in timber halls told of heroes who died in battle, but the true legacy of these decades was the forging of realms. Out of bloodshed came borders, out of raids came rule. The island was becoming something new, and the struggle for its soul was far from finished. Though the air still carried the reek of raids and the noise of spears, a fresh kind of power was stirring in the north. Northumbria, forged from the union of Bernicia and Dara, rose above its rivals to become more than just another warrior kingdom. It became a center of learning, art, and faith, a beacon that drew attention not only from the rest of Britain, but from across the seas. These decades would later be remembered as a golden age, when kings and monks, warriors and scribes, together carved a legacy that outlived their fragile world. The story of Northumbria's ascent began with rulers strong enough to hold together its two restless halves. Bernicia had looked outward from its coastal fortress at Bamberg, while Dara had flourished further inland around York. The union of these realms was not easy, but in the hands of ambitious kings, it became the foundation for dominance. Edwin, Oswald, and Oswiu, names later celebrated in both history and hagiography, extended Northumbria's reach from the Pennines to the Forth. Their power rested on the sword, but also on something less tangible, the ability to harness faith and culture as tools of rule. When Edwin embraced Christianity in 627, he brought the prestige of Roman faith into his court. Baptized in the wooden church at York, he set a precedent that tied Northumbria to the continent's great Christian kingdoms. Monks arrived from Kent and Gaul, carrying books, relics, and the authority of Rome, yet the conversion was never straightforward. Old gods still lingered in villages and valleys, and many of Edwin's men kept one foot in the world of Woden and Thuna. Still, the king's public acceptance of Christianity gave the new faith a foothold among the aristocracy, planting roots that would deepen in the decades to come. Oswald, who followed Edwin, added another strand to the tapestry. Raised in exile among the monks of Iona, he brought Celtic Christianity back with him when he seized the throne. At his side came Aidan, a monk whose gentle manner and tireless teaching won hearts across the kingdom. From the island of Lindisfarne, Aidan founded a monastery that became the soul of Northumbria. Its wooden buildings looked humble, but within them, monks copied texts, preached to villagers, and trained a generation of clerics. The blend of Roman prestige and Celtic devotion gave Northumbria a religious character unlike any other kingdom of the time. This was also an age of dazzling art. On Iona and Lindisfarne, scribes bent over vellum, their quills scratching intricate patterns of knotwork and bright pigments. Gospel books emerged, their pages alive with interlaced beasts, spirals, and crosses, combining Irish, Anglo-Saxon, and Mediterranean influences. These manuscripts were more than scripture. They were symbols of cultural fusion, proof that out of conquest and conversion, something radiant could be born. The art of this period still speaks across the centuries, testimony to a kingdom that embraced beauty as fiercely as it did power. While monks sang psalms on the shore, warriors still gathered in timber halls. Northumbria's kings could not rule by prayer alone. They demanded tribute from farmers, enforced order through retinues of armed men, and fought rival kingdoms in both Britain and Ireland. Yet even here, something was changing. Victories were celebrated not only in feasts and song, but in stone crosses raised in villages, carved with both Christian symbols and warrior imagery. Memory was shifting from oral praise to permanent monuments, rooted in the land for all to see. Daily life for common folk remained tied to the soil. Families in sunken, flawed huts tended barley, oats, and rye. Women spun wool, wove cloth, and brewed ale, while children carried water from streams and gathered firewood. Life was still precarious, threatened by hunger and war, but the presence of monasteries offered moments of stability. Monks taught children letters, healed the sick with herbs and prayer, and provided hospitality to travelers. To peasants who had known little but the demands of lords, these small mercies left a deep impression. The Synod of Whitby in 664 brought Northumbria's distinctive experiment to a decisive moment. Roman missionaries and Celtic monks clashed over the proper date of Easter and the style of tonsure. King Oswiu presided, listening as both sides argued their case. In the end, he chose Rome, declaring that he dared not oppose the authority of St. Peter, keeper of heaven's keys. The decision brought Northumbria firmly into the orbit of continental Christianity, aligning it with Europe's growing network of kingdoms. Yet the Celtic influence did not vanish. Its spirit lingered in monastic discipline, in art, and in the memory of saints who had walked the land. This fusion of power, faith, and culture gave Northumbria an aura that outshone its neighbours. To the south, Mercia and Wessex looked with envy at its reach. To the west, Britons in Wales saw in it both threat and inspiration. To the north, Picts watched warily as Northumbrian armies pressed their borders. Yet within the kingdom, the glow of its golden age masked the fragility beneath. Kings still fell to assassination and battle. Dynasties still faltered, and famine could undo years of prosperity. Its brilliance was real, but it burned against a backdrop of constant danger. What makes these decades remarkable is not that war ceased, but that culture flourished despite it. The halls of kings resounded with poets' songs, but so too did cloisters hum with the sound of quills and chants. Farmers ploughed the earth, monks illuminated gospels, warriors guarded frontiers, and bishops wrote letters to Rome. Together, these threads wove a fabric that carried Northumbria's name into history. When travellers crossed its lands, they found not only strength of arms, but strength of mind. A kingdom that had risen from the violence of migration and conquest now claimed a place in the wider Christian world. Its art, its saints, and its kings stood as proof that even in an age of upheaval, brilliance could emerge. And though its glory would not last forever, the memory of its golden age lingered, carved in stone crosses, painted in manuscripts, and whispered in stories that outlived the men who had shaped it. The light of Northumbria's golden age spread far across the island, but light always casts shadows. In the late 7th century, Britain stood in a fragile balance. Kingdoms had grown stronger, monasteries flourished, and learning reached new heights. Yet dangers stirred beyond the horizon. Sailors whispered of raids along distant coasts, of northern seafarers whose hunger for plunder was matched only by their skill at sea. The Viking threat had not yet struck Britain, but its shadow loomed. Within monasteries and villages, people sensed that the peace of their age would not last forever. Life within the cloister contrasted sharply with the clangor of war bands. Monastic communities multiplied during these years, dotting the landscape from Lindisfarne in the north to Glastonbury in the southwest. They were more than centres of prayer. They were schools, farms, workshops, and scriptoria. Behind their timber palisades or stone walls, monks rose before dawn, chanting psalms in the cold of the chapel, their voices carrying into the misty fields. After prayers, they bent to work, tilling gardens, copying manuscripts, brewing ale, or tending sheep. The cycle of the hours gave rhythm to lives that sought eternity within the fleeting span of mortal days. Monasteries were also engines of culture. The Lindisfarne Gospels, produced in this period, dazzled with their intricate designs, knotwork interlacing across pages alive with colour. The artistry combined influences from Ireland, Saxon England, and the Mediterranean, proof of a world more connected than the ruins of Rome suggested. Each manuscript was a labour of years, every letter a testimony that beauty could be born even in times when hunger and violence were never far away. These books became treasures, carried with pride, kissed with reverence, and guarded as relics almost as holy as the bones of saints. For villagers beyond monastery walls, the presence of such communities brought both benefits and tensions. Monks offered alms to the poor, healing herbs for the sick, and teaching for noble children. They turned wild ground into fields, drained marshes, and improved farming techniques. Yet they also demanded labour, rents, and protection. A peasant who saw his son taken as a novice might rejoice at his education, or grieve at the loss of a pair of hands in the fields. Monasteries stood as both refuge and burden, shaping the lives of those who lived in their shadow. The kings of the late 7th century recognized the power of these institutions and wove them into their authority. Pious rulers endowed monasteries with land and treasures, ensuring prayers for their souls and support for their reigns. Some even took vows themselves when age or defeat pressed too heavily. Courts and cloisters became intertwined, each lending legitimacy to the other. A king might build a monastery beside his hall, binding his dynasty's memory to both altar and throne. Yet within the halls of learning and sanctity, unease lingered. Ships from the north had been sighted along other shores, their raids spoken of in hushed voices. In Britain, the coasts remained mostly untouched for now, but the thought of sudden violence haunted the imagination. Monasteries, with their wealth of gold chalices and jeweled reliquaries, stood as tempting targets. The monks prayed for protection, but even as they sang, some feared that their walls would not hold when the strangers came. The contrast between cloistered devotion and peasant struggle was stark. In villages, life remained bound to the soil. Farmers followed the seasons, mending tools, tending livestock, and storing grain. Hunger could return with a single failed harvest, and disease claimed lives more often than battle. Faith offered comfort, but survival depended on relentless toil. The glow of illuminated manuscripts and the chants of monks seemed distant to families who measured wealth in sheep and the hope that their children would live through the winter. Even so, threads of connection bound the two worlds together. Pilgrims walked from village to shrine, leaving offerings of wool or bread. Relics of saints travelled from cloisters to halls, blessing kings and rallying warriors. Feasts of the church marked the calendar, giving rhythm to communal life. Pagan rites had not vanished. Offerings at wells, charms for fertility, and seasonal bonfires persisted. But they increasingly intertwined with Christian feasts, producing a rhythm of worship that was both old and new. In these decades, Britain carried both promise and vulnerability. The promise lay in its monasteries, in the art of its scribes, in the endurance of its farmers. The vulnerability lay in its wealth, concentrated in treasuries and libraries that could not be defended with prayers alone. The monks of Lindisfarne, of Wearmouth and Jarrow could not know how soon the sea would bring fire to their doors, but the fear already lurked. For now, however, the island basked in its fragile peace. The glow of candlelight on vellum pages, the echo of psalms at midnight, the laughter of children in fields, all these gave texture to life in the years before the storm. Britain stood in a moment between ages, a land of growing kingdoms and rising monasteries, unaware that ships already stirred on distant waters, their prows pointed toward the wealth of its shores. As the 8th century opened, the balance of power on the island began to tilt once more. Northumbria's brilliance still glowed in monasteries and courts, but its unity was fragile, its kings vulnerable to intrigue and sudden death. In the south, Kent and Wessex remained ambitious, yet it was Mercia, the kingdom of the Midlands, that now gathered strength. From its heartlands along the River Trent, Mercia expanded outward, swallowing smaller neighbours, pressing against borders and weaving alliances that reached from coast to coast. These were the decades when Mercia rose from a regional power to the looming presence of central Britain. The land itself favoured Mercia. Wide river valleys and fertile plains provided grain and pasturage in abundance. Forests gave timber for halls and fuel for smiths. From this base, Mercian rulers demanded tribute not only in food, but in service, forging bonds of loyalty that could summon warriors quickly when rivals threatened. As their dominion widened, they built not only halls for feasting, but also estates that showed a growing sense of permanence. Great timber complexes rose, their size dwarfing the huts of common folk, their architecture designed to impress all who entered. To stand before such a hall was to feel the authority of a king who claimed the right to rule more than his own valley. Trade reinforced that authority. By this time, markets had begun to flourish again. At crossroads, in river ports, and near monastic centres, merchants gathered with goods from across the channel. Salt, wine, and glass came from the continent. Wool, grain, and hides went in return. Even in an age often remembered for isolation, Britain's rulers were tied into wider networks of commerce. Mercian kings exploited this, taxing markets, controlling trade routes, and rewarding followers with imported treasures that proved their reach extended beyond the island. Coins reappeared, minted under royal authority, stamped with symbols that carried a message as much as monetary value. Here was a ruler who claimed Rome's mantle of order. For the ordinary farmer, these changes meant both opportunity and burden. Markets allowed surplus produce to be exchanged for tools, salt, or ornaments. Villages near trade routes thrived, their households a little richer, their tables set with glass beads or decorated pottery. But markets also brought new obligations. Lords demanded rents in kind to exchange for continental goods, and peasants laboured harder to meet these demands. Still, the rhythm of village life remained much the same. Sowing in spring, harvesting in autumn, storing for the hungry months of winter. It was the taxes owed to lords and the calls to service that tied these labours into the wider story of Mercian supremacy. Religion, too, shaped this age. Monasteries continued to multiply, now less isolated and more integrated into the political fabric of kingdoms. Rulers endowed abbeys not only for piety but for power, ensuring that prayers for their souls were paired with loyalty from influential abbots. In Mercia, religious houses dotted the countryside, serving as both spiritual havens and centres of economic activity. Monks copied texts, but they also managed estates, collected rents, and advised kings. The partnership of throne and altar deepened, binding secular and sacred in a web that supported Mercian authority. The countryside bore the marks of this transformation. Seasonal rhythms ruled peasant lives, ploughing with heavy oxen in muddy fields, mending tools in the long nights of winter, gathering flocks from highland pastures before the frosts set in. Women managed spinning and weaving, their looms producing cloth for households and tribute alike. Children fetched water, minded animals, and learned the skills of survival from their elders. Though their names are lost, their labours sustain the great halls and monasteries, whose remains still mark the landscape. Not all welcomed Mercia's expansion. In the south, Wessex resisted, its kings determined to preserve independence. In the east, East Anglia pushed back against encroachment. Yet Mercia's rulers proved adept not only at war, but at diplomacy, arranging marriages, fostering heirs in rival courts, and forging bonds that reached across the Channel. By strength of arms and subtle negotiation, they extended their reach until their supremacy seemed unshakable. This was not yet the age of Offa and his monumental works, but the ground was being prepared. Mercian kings of the early 8th century laid the foundations, gathering wealth, building networks, and asserting dominance over neighbours. Their courts blended the warrior ethos of old with the beginnings of structured governance. Assemblies confirmed laws, disputes were settled under royal oversight, and coinage provided a visible sign of order. The Saxon world was maturing into something more than shifting warbands and fragile alliances. It was hardening into kingdoms with continuity, identity, and ambition. The monasteries of these decades preserved more than prayers. They became the island's archives, where charters were copied, annals recorded, and the memory of kings enshrined in ink. From their scriptoria, we begin to glimpse the outlines of history again, no longer dependent solely on legend, but shaped by records. Names of rulers, dates of battles, and accounts of councils survive because monks committed them to vellum. In this way, the cultural continuity of Rome found a new expression, carried not by governors or legions, but by abbots and scribes. And yet, even amid this progress, life remained precarious. Famine still threatened after poor harvests, disease still struck without warning, and warfare could undo years of stability in a single summer. Villages rebuilt, kings fell, monasteries burned, but the pattern of endurance continued. Britain had grown stronger, its kingdoms larger, its connections wider, but it was still a land where survival was never certain. The rise of Mercia marked a turning point. Power was no longer fragmented among dozens of petty lords. It was coalescing into fewer, stronger hands. Kings began to dream of ruling not just valleys, but whole regions. The idea of supremacy, of overlordship across multiple peoples took hold. In that dream lay both opportunity and danger. For while Mercia grew powerful, its neighbours watched, waited, and prepared their own claims. The island's story was not yet one of unity, but of rival ambitions sharpening against each other. The sound of shovels striking soil echoed along Mercia's western border. Under the eye of overseers, lines of labourers cut into the earth, piling ridges that climbed higher with every hour. Stretching for more than 100 miles, the barrier snaked across valleys and hills, separating Saxon from Britain. This was Offa's dike, not simply a defence, but a statement carved into the land itself. No traveller could cross it without knowing who ruled on the eastern side. It was Offa's way of saying that Mercia was no longer just another kingdom. It was the kingdom. The man who commanded this work had risen above every rival. Offa inherited a realm already strong, But through war, diplomacy, and sheer determination, he reshaped Mercia into the center of power in Britain. He was no warlord ruling from a timber hall for a brief season. He thought in decades, in monuments, in coins stamped with his name. His ambition was not only to survive, but to impose order on a land that had known centuries of uncertainty. At the heart of this vision lay wealth. Mercia's fertile midlands gave grain and cattle in abundance, and trade routes threaded through its rivers and valleys. Offa harnessed these resources, ensuring tribute flowed into his coffers. He minted silver pennies in his own name, their circulation binding markets to his authority. For a peasant at a fair, the coin was a tool of exchange. For Offa, it was a declaration that kingship could command not just warriors, but an economy. The sight of his image struck into silver made him more than a local ruler. It made him a sovereign recognized across the channel. The court he built reflected this wealth. Halls rose larger and grander, their beams carved, their feasts resplendent with imported wines and jeweled ornaments. Nobles gathered there, dazzled by the display, bound to their king through both awe and obligation. Bards praised his victories, while ambassadors from Frankish lands sat at his table. Charlemagne himself corresponded with Offa, sometimes as ally, sometimes as rival, but always as equal. Few British rulers had ever spoken across the sea with such confidence. Religion gave Offa another avenue to tighten his hold. Monasteries had multiplied for generations, drawing gifts from kings eager to secure prayers for their souls. Offa went further. He poured wealth into abbeys, yet also bent them to his will. By elevating Lichfield as a new archbishopric, he challenged Canterbury's supremacy, forcing even the church to acknowledge Mercia's dominance. Faith was both devotion and strategy. To rule men's souls was to rule their loyalties, and Offa ensured the cross served alongside the crown. Law and justice, too, bore his mark. Though records are fragmentary, evidence suggests his court functioned as a place of judgment, disputes settled beneath his gaze. In a land where vengeance often replaced fairness, the image of a king dispensing measured justice enhanced his authority. Offa's presence in matters of law reinforced the sense that order flowed from him, that Mercia's peace was his gift and Mercia's discipline his command. Yet for all this grandeur, the lives of common people were as hard as ever. Peasants still bent over fields from dawn to dusk, driving oxen, weeding crops, and hoping for harvests strong enough to endure winter. Women spun wool into cloth, baked bread in clay ovens, and nursed children through sickness. Tribute was heavier than before, demanded not only in grain, but in labor for massive projects like the dike. Many toiled for glory they would never share, their sweat feeding the vision of a king whose name they might never see on silver. The splendor of Mercia rested on their shoulders, though their stories went unrecorded. The dike itself symbolized this dual truth, a marvel of ambition, but built from the hands of ordinary folk. It did not stop every raid, yet it stood as a visible scar across the land, proof of a king's will impressed on the earth. For those who labored on it, the dike was grueling work. For Offa, it was permanence, a boundary that claimed to hold back chaos. Mercia's supremacy was not unchallenged. Wessex pressed against its borders. East Anglia resisted subjugation, and Welsh kingdoms bristled at Offa's show of strength. Skirmishes flared, but Offa's blend of might and diplomacy usually prevailed. Marriages cemented alliances, punishments crushed rebellion, and campaigns reminded rivals of Mercia's reach. He was overlord to many, feared by most, and respected by all. The treasures of his reign show a society that had moved beyond survival. Gold buckles, garnet-inlaid jewelry, and silverwork of exquisite detail reveal artisans supported by steady patronage. These were not the makeshift goods of warbands, but the luxuries of a court confident in its continuity. Kingship had become spectacle as much as power, a performance of stability that set Mercia apart from the shifting chaos of earlier centuries. And yet, beneath the brilliance, fragility remained. Famine could still empty storehouses. Disease could still spread unchecked, and rebellion lurked in every ambitious noble. Offa's system held so long as he lived, but no structure in Britain had ever proven eternal. His death in 796 left Mercia strong, but without the force of his personality to bind it, the cracks began to show. The dike still cut across the hills, the coins still bore his image, the churches still prayed for his soul, but the hand that had made Mercia supreme was gone. Offa's reign was a high watermark, a vision of what kingship in Britain could be, when ambition, wealth, and faith converged. He built not only boundaries in earth, but a sense of order that outshone every rival. And yet, like all earthly achievements, it was fleeting. The island that had seemed on the brink of stability would soon face storms greater than any border or coin could withstand. Ships already prowled northern seas, their sails like wings of ravens, and when they came ashore, Britain would remember that even the greatest king could not command the tide. Calm summer tides bore the first longships as they glided toward the shores of Britain. Their prows were carved like beasts, their hulls long and sleek, their sails full in the wind. To the monks of Lindisfarne, the island monastery perched on its tidal shore. They must have seemed no different from trading vessels at first. But these ships carried no merchants. They brought warriors from the north, men hardened by sea and steel, and with them came terror unlike anything the island had seen in generations. In 793, Lindisfarne was stormed. Monks were slaughtered at their altars, relics scattered, and treasures seized. To contemporaries, it felt like the end of the world. Chroniclers wrote of dragons in the sky, storms lashing the land, and a punishment sent by God. To the survivors, it was simpler and more brutal, an attack that left bodies on the sand and smoke rising above a place once thought sacred. Britain had known raids before, Picts, Irish, Saxons, but the Vikings brought something new, relentless speed, ferocity, and the sense that nowhere, not even holy ground, was safe. Monasteries were the first targets. They were wealthy, isolated, and poorly defended. Lindisfarne was followed by Jarrow, Iona, and others. Chalices of gold, jeweled gospel covers, and silver reliquaries were carried off. Monks who had spent lives in prayer found themselves dragged to ships as captives, their fates sealed in distant markets. These holy places had been centers of light in an uncertain age, but their very wealth painted a target. The Viking axe cut not only into wood and flesh, but into the heart of Britain's spiritual identity. Coastal villages suffered as well. Fishermen and farmers who had lived in uneasy peace now watched the horizon with dread. Longships could appear with little warning, striking fast, looting what they could, and vanishing before any force could be mustered. Smoke rising from a settlement became a familiar sight along exposed shores. Families fled inland, carrying what they could, hiding livestock in woods and praying that their lord's warriors might arrive in time. But even kings found themselves powerless against raiders who fought where they chose and left before dawn. The rhythm of farming life faltered under the threat. Sowing and harvesting still had to be done, but fields near the coast were abandoned, and some communities retreated inland. Markets that had begun to flourish under Mercian order grew tense. Merchants wary of transporting goods where ships might intercept them. For peasants, survival meant hiding stores in pits, building watchfires, and living with the constant anxiety that the sea itself had become an enemy. Yet Britain was not helpless. Kings and lords responded by fortifying coasts and marshalling defences. Forts were strengthened, fleets assembled, and villages encouraged to band together. Still, the very mobility of the raiders made them difficult to resist. A fleet might strike in Northumbria one month, East Anglia the next, and vanish to Frankish shores before a counterattack could be mounted. Warfare had shifted, and the island's rulers struggled to adapt. The terror of the raids left deep impressions. Stories spread quickly, told in halls and villages alike. People spoke of warriors with iron helms and bright shields, of axes that split helmets, of strangers who laughed in battle and showed no reverence for cross or saint. The image of the Viking became larger than life, both monster and man, an embodiment of fear that blurred reality and myth. Chroniclers painted them as scourges of God, sent to chastise a sinful people. In truth, they were men seeking wealth, but their violence and suddenness made them feel supernatural. For the monks who survived, the memory was seared into scripture and song. Illuminated manuscripts depict strange beasts and apocalyptic visions, perhaps reflecting the trauma of seeing their sanctuaries defiled. For ordinary folk, the impact was measured in hunger, grief, and the knowledge that safety was gone. Children grew up with stories of fires on the coast, of kin carried off into slavery, of treasures lost forever. These memories shaped how the next generation would view both faith and kingship. But raids did more than destroy. They forced rulers to change. Kings began to build stronger ties with the church, recognizing that monasteries could not survive without protection, and in turn demanding prayers for victory and stability. Nobles fortified their estates, surrounding halls with earthworks and timber palisades. Villages clustered more tightly around lords, seeking the shelter of warriors. Power became measured not only by the wealth a king could display, but by the security he could guarantee against raiders. At the same time, the raids opened Britain further to the wider world. Viking fleets sailed across the North Sea with ease, linking Britain to Scandinavia in a web of violence, but also of exchange. Goods looted in monasteries ended up in markets as far away as the Baltic. Captives from Britain were sold into slavery in lands their families had never heard of. The island that had once seemed distant now discovered it was tied to seas that carried both opportunity and peril. Daily life under this shadow was marked by resilience. Farmers adjusted planting cycles, herding animals to hidden valleys when raids were expected. Women safeguarded family treasures in buried hoards, some of which still surface today. Children were taught not only to tend fields, but to watch horizons, to read the wind and the water for signs of danger. Fear became part of survival, but so did adaptation. Tested and battered, the church survived. Monasteries rebuilt after attacks, their monks refusing to abandon their call. Some communities moved inland, choosing less vulnerable sites. Others grew sterner, their prayers laced with the urgency of those who had seen death at the altar. Saints' cults multiplied, miracles attributed to holy men who could protect communities from the invaders. Pilgrimage increased as people sought divine protection against a threat no earthly ruler seemed able to halt. The memory of these first Viking raids never faded. They were spoken of not just as events, but as turning points, moments when Britain realized that its wealth and faith were exposed to forces beyond its borders. Lindisfarne, in 793, became a symbol, remembered long after other battles were forgotten. It marked the end of an age of fragile stability and the beginning of one defined by constant vigilance. And yet, even in the face of fire and fear, the island endured. Kings adjusted, peasants adapted, monks rebuilt, and communities learned new ways to survive. The longships would return again and again, but so too would resilience. Britain's story was not one of collapse, but of endurance tested against a new enemy. The raids of these decades were the first strokes of a storm that would grow fiercer, but they also revealed a strength that no blade or fire could erase. The smoke of raids had become a familiar stain on the horizon by the 9th century. What began with sudden strikes on monasteries had grown into a pattern of life, a rhythm of fear and resilience. Britain's kingdoms stood wary, their coasts scarred, their people hardened by decades of uncertainty. Yet amid the threat, the land was far from broken. Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria vied for dominance, while smaller realms clung to survival. Each ruler sought not only to protect his own people, but to claim the mantle of leadership in a world that demanded strength. Wessex emerged as a rising force, nestled in the fertile valleys of the south. Its kings built power steadily, drawing strength from both land and lineage. Their halls resounded with the voices of warriors bound by oaths, and their fields yielded the grain that fed ambition. In Mercia, the legacy of Offa still lingered, though his successors struggled to maintain supremacy. Northumbria, brilliant in its golden age, now staggered under the weight of internal strife and the relentless pressure of Viking raiders. Power shifted like the tides, each kingdom watching the others for weakness, each preparing for the day when fortune turned. For nobles, this was a time of delicate balance. They swore loyalty to kings, but kept their own ambitions close, ready to seize opportunity should their lord falter. Feasts in timber halls displayed both generosity and suspicion, with warriors gauging which master might best reward their swords. For peasants, the rivalries of kings mattered little compared to the demands of the soil. They still ploughed in narrow strips, tended livestock, and prayed for steady harvests. Yet even they felt the weight of political change. For tribute grew heavier, and watchfires along coasts reminded them that raiders might descend at any time. Religion remained the island's thread of continuity. Monasteries rebuilt after raids, their monks refusing to abandon their calling. New churches rose in villages, simple structures of timber and thatch, where priests blessed fields, baptized children, and offered prayers against sickness and war. Christianity was no longer fragile. It had sunk roots deep enough to endure flame and sword. Saints' cults flourished, their shrines attracting pilgrims who sought protection and healing. The faith that had once been contested now united much of the land, giving kings another tool of legitimacy and communities a shared hope. Daily life carried on under the shadow of looming transformation. Farmers hid stores in pits against sudden raids. Women buried family treasures beneath hearths, trusting the earth to keep them safe. Children grew up with tales of saints and of raiders, of kings who fought bravely, and of villages that vanished overnight. In their world, caution was as natural as breathing, but so too was resilience. The ability to rebuild, to carry on despite loss, became the defining strength of the age. Yet this was not only a time of fear. Trade still flowed across the channel. Frankish coins circulated in markets, glass beads glittered in necklaces, and garnets from distant lands adorned brooches. Britain was not isolated. It was connected by sea to a wider world, its rulers aware that their power was measured not only in spears, but in the wealth they could command. Even Viking raids, brutal as they were, tied the island more tightly to northern seas, binding its fate to Scandinavia in ways no one yet understood. The distinctions between peoples grew sharper. Saxon and Briton, once mingled in a twilight of survival, now stood apart with clearer identities. Language, law, and custom defined communities, and while intermarriage still occurred, the sense of belonging to one culture or another hardened. Yet beneath these differences lay the same human concerns: the harvest, the family, the hope for safety. In this, all shared the same fragile existence, bound together by the land itself. As the middle of the 9th century approached, Britain stood at a threshold. The kingdoms had grown stronger, their rulers more ambitious, their faith more secure. Yet the raids that had begun as scattered strikes were evolving into something greater. Fleets grew larger, their attacks more coordinated, their ambitions shifting from plunder to conquest. What had once been terror from the sea was becoming a new kind of war, one that would reshape the island's future. The people of Britain could not know what was coming. They only knew that the horizon was never to be trusted, that smoke could rise at any time, that the strength of their kings would decide whether their villages endured. They lived with both fear and faith, building lives in the narrow space between uncertainty and hope. In their fields, their halls, and their churches, they carried forward traditions that had survived Rome's fall, plague, famine, and endless war. The story of Dark Age Britain was not one of simple collapse. It was a story of adaptation, of endurance in the face of disaster, of cultures clashing and blending, of faith remade and kingdoms born. From the ruins of empire, from the smoke of raids, from the toil of countless unnamed men and women, a new world was taking shape. Britain stood on the eve of transformation, poised between the memory of its past and the storm of the Viking Age that would soon engulf it.